Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was the person who helped found the Central Water Commission. And he was such a strong advocate for looking at people who are impacted by projects. And if he had lived long enough to see the impact that some of the dams have had on entire communities,
And cultures.
yes, he would have, I think, been the first to protest. We celebrate our rivers in our national anthem. We call many of our rivers sacred, but why is it that
we look at them purely utilitarian?
Yeah, it doesn't somehow, the flowing river is not what you want to protect or preserve, right? So basically, the idea of ecological flows comes in because humans are appropriating a lot of water, which would have otherwise have been part of natural and semi-natural riverine ecosystems, wetlands, all the way from the headwaters to the deltas and estuaries.
Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about the science, the stories, and the systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Veena Srinivasan. Every couple of weeks, we'll chat about how better data and evidence can result in better decision making and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So if you're a student, a researcher, an innovator, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can better manage this precious resource, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. Welcome to the Water Data Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy, who is an old colleague and friend, but also I would say one of the very, very, very few academics in India who understands in a very deep way both the water side as well as the ecology side of our work. I mean, I really can't think of very, very few other people who really understand how water impacts ecosystems and how ecosystems in turn shape water. Jagdish, it's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Veena. This is a pleasure and privilege for me as well.
I think I should say at the outset, and I already said it in my introduction, that there's really, I can't even think of a second person like you in India. I mean, that's how unique you are. But your career is much more prolific than what we can cover in the podcast today because, of course, you've been an IPCC author and you've done a lot of work on climate teleconnections. And then you've also done a lot of work on the pure ecology side of it, just understanding, feeding patterns of various species and so on. And we're not going to cover those two equally significant parts of your research career. But today we're going to just narrow down on one piece of it or two pieces of it, which are already so prolific that they even just that would make you kind of in a class of your own in India. So let's start with very, very broadly. You are an engineer, IIT Bombay, and from that sense, you come with an engineering brain. But then you became an ecologist, and your heart, I think, lies in India's forests and India's ecosystems. And so you've been able to blend those two pieces together. And I think you're really one of the foremost eco-hydrologists as well as hydroecologists, if you want to call it, in the country today. So let's start sort of with the eco-hydrology part of it, which is how do sort of forests and ecosystems shape water security or water availability for society and all the work you've done around that. So can you kind of start us talking about how you started this line of work, starting with the Western Ghats, then moving to the Himalayas, and some of the work around what made it interesting? What were the questions you were pursuing when you started looking at what's now called the infiltration evapotranspiration hypothesis and the sponge effect of forests and so on?
So, for one, civil engineers do learn about water systems and fluid mechanics, and there's also they learn about reservoirs and water systems in general. So that, and of course, the quantitative analytical framing that engineering provides. So that helps. And then I developed an interest in statistics, looking at data time series, and that's very important for hydrology, as you know very well. And so, working at Development Alternatives for 3 years after finishing my BTech from IIT Bombay, again, we dealt with issues related to watersheds and rivers and streams in one way or the other. And then following that, my master's and PhD from Duke University, the master's was in statistics and decision sciences, again reinforcing the time series, the spatial, geostatistical, all of these things that we know matters a lot in how we analyze and understand distribution of water over time and space. And then the PhD was based in Costa Rica, but again in the Teraba Basin, a river which was at that point in time was going to be dammed. And therefore, there had been an investment in many gauging stations, a lot of high quality secondary data, plus all the primary data that I was able to collect. And so one thing led to another. And then much earlier than that, I was always an amateur naturalist during my Kalprich days in Delhi. So finally, when I returned to India after finishing my PhD, I think the ecology and the hydrology and the engineering sort of merged and led to this type of work that I have been able to engage with over the years. Thanks to brilliant students, collaborators, supporters at ATRI and elsewhere, and that has made a big difference. I think all the opportunities that I got. And so there were these two streams that came. One is what we call eco-hydrology, which was an emerging field in the early 2000s. In fact, it was being defined at that point in time, which is basically looking at the role of vegetation in the water cycle, broadly speaking.
Right.
That is eco-hydrology.
Right.
Then there's the hydroecology, which is basically how does the distribution of moisture, water, fashion ecology, whether in the terrestrial or aquatic. And then so both then became parts of
your areas of inquiry that
exactly
you then spent the next
yes.
3 decades.
Yeah, so these two strands both I think remained strong for depending on the opportunities and projects that we got, and also remarkably lucky to have had hardcore ecology trained students who taught me a lot of ecology and I taught them hydrology. So over a period of time, we managed to fashion a cohort of people. Maybe there are about 100 plus in India and abroad who have been part of this partnership and collaboration and mutual learning.
Right.
And that's, I think, I would say has been a very interesting and a rewarding journey.
Right. Let's start with your early work, perhaps in the Western Ghats, on starting with the hydrology and looking at the role of forests in and how they. And I guess that went back to your PhD as well. You looked at similar things. The reason I really wanted you on this podcast was that, over all these years, you've done a ton of primary data work. That's not that common in India. You've done both the ecology side and the hydrology side. So I really want to go into those pieces of the work, saying what were the hypotheses you were chasing, and then how you actually went about it, and then what you found. So can you walk us through that entire process for the Western Ghats to start with?
So in the Western Ghats, the first opportunity we had for looking into the role of vegetation or forest cover on hydrology and also the services that we get, water services that we get from forests, was the Port UNESCO project in collaboration with the colleagues in the National Institute of Hydrology, Sharad and others, who were then in SICED. And that project actually gave us the opportunity to go to the field. And we chose two sets of sites. One was the dry forest in Bandipur. The other one were the more humid forests and agroecosystems in Uttara Kannada. I think for the first time, we were actually collecting field data on trying to understand the role that changes in vegetation plays in one way or the other.
Right.
And we actually struggled with the instrumentation, which was, and the failures of vandalism. Plus, when you set up instruments in these forests, elephants have an opinion on whether they should be there or not. So all of these actually made it very challenging. What we managed to do was actually have the first set of scholars who were looking into this using the idea of instrumented catchments. And it had been done before by the Central Water, Soil and Training Research Institute and also the Dehradun in the Himalayas for short periods of time. But here we were able to, in the Western Ghats, we were able to connect it a little more deeply, I would say, because we brought in the ecological and social aspects because we were working in these protected forests. And the whole question of whether conservation of forests is good for water services to people, it was not a trivial question, because when you look at the history of how people have viewed relationship between forests and water. It started with that forests attract rainfall,
right,
and all of that. And that was in the late 1800s.
Right,
And
all the way to the pioneers in the US, which
Yes.
says the rain follows the plow.
Yes. Then scientists found out that trees consume water, they transpire. And so then when hydrologists found out about evapotranspiration, then that paradigm became very strong. And so there was then the period of scholarship where people said trees consume water, so you can't attract rainfall, or you can't have more water flowing by planting more trees, because it might
The trees, they're going to take up all of that water,
yes,
much more than they actually
yes.
let go down.
And then later, there was a realization that the water that's released into the atmosphere from forests doesn't disappear somewhere. It gets recycled back as rainfall. And in many parts of the world, the recycled fraction of this evapotranspiration coming back as rainfall is very critical for everybody, ecosystems, all the biodiversity, and people.
Right.
And whether it's in Amazonia, where it's much more very well studied over many decades, but now more recently, Northeast India, Western Ghats as well, this phenomena of this atmospheric rivers,
right,
which when you have forests influencing the amount of rainfall.
Right.
So what was debunked at some point.
So the rain does follow the plow, except not in the same place.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
somewhere else.
Somewhere else at a different scale altogether.
Right.
It's
It could be in the country that you don't like very much. I mean, it could be,
India
you
exports
can't
moisture to other countries too.
Right.
Yes.
Can you explain what you found about the dry season flows and the sponge effect and so on?
Yeah. So for a long time, conservationists, foresters had been talking about how forests, they absorb rainfall during the wet season, and then they're like a sponge because they have this the well-developed soil layer with a lot of organic matter, and then the high infiltration rate in soils with high organic matter with macropores because of tree roots and everything, and all the uh, earthworms and other fauna. All of that results in this sponge effect, and then that water is released slowly in the dry season, and therefore you have perennial streams coming out of forested areas.
Right.
So that was the paradigm for a long time, and then the evapotranspiration part came in, and when people actually found that in some places where you establish tree cover, you end up actually reducing the amount of water going into the streams in the dry season.
Right. This is where there's new forest or new reforestation.
Yes, but then people started, in the sense that, see, there are good reasons to keep natural forests intact for other services, other reasons as well. So I think the debate became much more pronounced when there were calls for tree planting on a massive scale. And that's where work of people like Calder and others do pioneering work in this field,
right,
including on species like eucalyptus.
Yeah.
And that too in Karnataka.
Yeah.
We are in Karnataka, and Karnataka in the mid 90s was actually where a lot of eco-hydrology work happened.
Yeah.
So then that realization of that tree planting, it may not be great for the water cycle or for hydrologic services for people, that was there. So as hydrologists, we knew both of these things. And Sampurna Brunzell's work on the infiltration evapotranspiration trade-off. So he was the one who actually coined that hypothesis. So that was one of the hypotheses that we were able to test over a period of time in the Western Ghats and elsewhere, using primary data, but also with secondary data from Costa Rica and others.
Right.
And now I think it's a fairly well-established phenomenon. It doesn't occur everywhere. And it applies most, I feel, to places where we have to make decisions about how much to plant, at what densities we should plant, whether we should actually plant trees at all, or maybe have some other type of vegetation like grasses and shrubs. So that's where I feel the infiltration, evapotranspiration trade-off hypothesis applies, because nobody, I think, in their right mind is going to say that let's manipulate the vegetation of a biodiversity hotspot just because we'll get more dry season water.
Sure. So let me just unpack several of the things. Of course, what you said is there's two parts to it. One is what happens to water and moisture, the local hydrological cycle. Yeah. And then we know that forests kind of recycle water, but not in the local basin. It might be, several basins downwind. No. But within the local basin, it kind of depends. And the work that you guys first did in the Fort UNESCO project, basically you looked at different types of catchments. You looked at pristine forest, which was natural forest, which was maintained, degraded forest, and then you looked at plantations, right?
Of acacia auriculiformis.
Of acacia.
Yeah.
And then you looked at basically what happened to dry season flow in these three,
Yes.
As well as quick flow during the monsoon.
Yeah.
And really, you found that the natural forest had this sponge mechanism. It was able to hold water and then release it in a very, very quantitative way. You were able to show that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, in that particular paper, it was surprising to me that the degraded forest was much worse, and the acacia or the plantation sort of halfway in between.
Yes.
Roughly.
Yes.
And is that because of the species, or is it just that when you destroy a natural forest and you've destroyed that entire, soil layer, it just takes a long time to build it up in a plantation? Or if you have a monoculture of a fast-growing species like acacia, you're just not ever going to get to it because of the evapotranspiration, essentially. They're just taking up too much water. What's the main effect?
Yeah, I think because they're not exactly comparable. As you know, we are using a space for time substitution study, right?
Right.
Ideally, we would want to,
have
one
2
can't do it.
decades and
You have a natural forest, you degrade it, and then
plant
you
it back.
look at what happens to the hydrology. Now, we are not in a position to do that. It's obviously, that has happened in some parts of the world.
But at very small scales, we're not recommending.
So we have to compare different catchments, which may have different land cover, but they also have different histories in terms of some geology, some local geological, geomorphological, some differences in soil, and more importantly, the way people have been using that piece of land.
Right.
And that can change the soil. So it's not just the effect of, I would say, the vegetation alone, but other things that go along with it.
Right.
And the
because
manner.
Where you have degradation, it's because humans have been trampling and cattle have been grazing, and
many other
soil has been getting compacted over time.
Trails are formed.
Trails are formed, which are compacted again.
Yes.
So,
So we found, for example, in Bandipur, even the trails made by the forest department and other trails, even trails made by animals and so on, they were conduits for overland flow in the monsoon.
Right.
So these things they might occupy a very small proportion of the landscape, but they have a disproportionate impact on the hydrology, on the surface hydrology. So that is one thing that trails and roads can make a huge difference.
Right.
So on a satellite map, it looks nice, forested area, but actually speaking, on the ground,
under all that tree canopy,
yes,
what you're not seeing is all that compacted.
What you're not able to see through satellite imagery, you might be able to understand better. Of course, now with the advances in the resolution of satellite imagery, we have very fine scale imagery. We are obviously in a much better position to look at even what is happening.
Small roads.
Yes,
like that.
But at that time, we actually felt that investment in ground measurements was the way to understand some of this. Interestingly, in the dry forests, like in a place like Bandipur, evapotranspiration actually is like 70 to 90% of the total rainfall.
Yeah.
And so it's only in some years that you can actually have recharge to groundwater. And so it's like and so that is one thing interesting that, we should have been able to predict that knowing knowledge, but then it was good to
actually measure and show that. Yeah.
And then that also means that people who depend on runoff and store it in small tanks for irrigation, they're also now part of this this hydrology, which has got this very narrow window in terms of rainfall and evapotranspiration for recharge, and the streams are ephemeral.
Right.
They're not perennial.
Right.
So these are interesting things that we found out about the dry forest hydrology as well as the wet forest hydrology.
Right. And some of the sponge effect that you talked about is very critical for work on springs, for example, which you did both in the Western Ghats as well as in the Sikkim Eastern Himalayas. So I was wondering whether, firstly, you want to talk a little bit about the springs work in the Eastern Himalayas, but then generally about the work that you did there.
Yeah, the springs work, and thanks to Manish Kumar, my PhD student, he was the main person behind my introduction to springs as a very unique groundwater system.
Right.
And their springs are found all over the country, and even the work of folks like Himanshu Kulkarni and all, they have shown that they are an important groundwater system,
Right.
neglected often in previous
And yet, communities are critical. Even under Jal Jeevan Mission is still in the hills,
yes,
depends on spring.
in the mountains, they are the lifeline for many people.
Yeah.
One, they are generally of higher quality because they have a groundwater
filtered
pathway
through the groundwater. Yeah.
and then they are also found in remote places far away from even on mountain slopes. Villages can use spring water for drinking water as well as for irrigation. What we found in our work was that there was an interest in springs, and the people were measuring Sandeep Tambe's work in Sikkim, the part of the government. They started looking at springs and spring sheds, and the realization that their spring sheds are not topographically defined was something that was interesting for us as hydrologists who were trained to look at topography-based
unit of analysis.
catchment.
Yeah.
So that is one. So you could have the recharge area of a spring on
the other side of the mountain.
Yes, yeah. And then you have the pathway aquifer cutting through, discharging as a spring on this side of the hill. So that was one interesting thing for me. Of course, it was known to other folks. But how do you actually define the spring shed? To me, to even now, I think it depends a lot on experience, and it's not exact as a topographically defined catchment. I think you need to have a lot of knowledge of geology, which is another thing that I think many hydrologists actually don't learn.
Yeah.
We don't learn enough geology in civil engineering for sure.
We're not taught enough ecology or geology. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the two fields that.
So that I think plays a very big role in even now. I think there are very few people in the country I think who are capable of identifying a spring shed properly. But it has happened. And that was one. The other thing is that, springs were considered as geophysical systems. You have rainfall infiltrating, recharging, and then it's discharging as a. What we found based on the high resolution time series data.
Right. I remember that Manish had actually instrumented springs as well, right? And many of them, and just looked at how the flows changed over time in different types of forests.
So what we found is that when we looked at the time series data in the wet season, dry season, we found that there are different types of springs, depression spring and karst springs, and so different types of springs are there. Also, we found that there may be more than one layer contributing to the discharge of a spring. So it's a sort of a multi aquifer top sort of system. And that showed up in our high resolution data when we looked over time, when we did some modeling with it.
Right.
So that was one interesting.
And specifically, just to clarify that, it was because you were able to see that the flow rate kind of was one amount, and then suddenly it kind of dropped to a different regime after some period.
Yeah, so we were able to, using analytical tools available to surface hydrologists, we were able to, the rate of change of discharge with time as a function of storage and all those relations when we looked at, we actually found parallel lines in that. You should actually have one line.
Right.
And we actually found parallel lines, which suggested that there's more than one system contributing to the spring. That was one. And the other thing we found out was, given that these were considered as purely geophysical systems, we now know that they are biogeophysical systems, because we found that they also had a diurnal
evapotranspirational signal.
Yeah, driven. So either most likely at the places close to the slopes where they're discharging, the trees are tapping into the spring water, and a more distant effect is probably in the recharge area on the other side of the hill, where there could be some. But I think most of what we know right now is that the impact of vegetation on springs is likely to be on the slopes where the discharge is happening.
Right.
So now we know that the spring water is also regulated by vegetation.
Right.
And that spring water is important for the maintenance of these very important Himalayan forests as well.
And that itself was a fascinating set of findings, right? The fact that they are not just geological systems, but biogeological systems. Yeah. Was there any work on what happens when Himalayan forests are degraded because of course that's deforestation we know in some of these, how that was contributing to springs as well?
We were not able to do that given our study design. And I think that a longer time series is required where you're actually able to see such impacts. So most of our forests in Sikkim are already secondary forests. What we have found through another set of measurements, basically measuring the transpiration of trees using sap flux sensors. I think that Manish's work in Sikkim was the first of its kind in the Eastern Himalayas, certainly, if not for the...
No, I remember. Very, very nice work.
And there we found that the secondary forests have a much higher rate of transpiration compared possibly to primary. So it has implications for changes in the way forests are interacting with the water cycle and their transpiration over a period of time. So we will be able to
so basically, that's a case where the infiltration evapotranspiration hypothesis, you're finding that secondary forests are taking up more than primary forests too.
I think the one point we have to remember is these secondary forests are very valuable because that's all we have right now.
We're not saying,
So, so
that's all you have right now. We're not saying cut it off.
So I think this issue of looking at the infiltration, evapotranspiration trade-off hypothesis, that is, you need, so forests can allow high infiltration rates and allow very good recharge of groundwater like it happens in the Western Ghats and maintain perennial streams in the summer on one hand, but they also can evapotranspire. I think that issue is misplaced when it's applied to natural forests. It's from the policy point of view, it is relevant for where we want to manage new tree plantations, where to plant, what densities do we plant, what are the species we should plant, whether we should convert a grassland into a tree plantation. That's where I think that this eco-hydrologic perspective is most useful.
Right. Let me just unpack that. You're saying nobody cares about, if you want to call it the hydrologic ecosystem services of natural forests, from the perspective of should we cut off a natural forest because it has so many other ecosystem services which are
plus the recycling
important. And plus the atmospheric thing. So where this infiltration evapotranspiration hypothesis really matters is in new projects. And I know you've written about the camper funds and so on there as well. Do you have our episodes running in the background? If you're curious about a technical term that we use or an acronym we've forgotten to expand, check out our video episodes on YouTube. We have on-screen explanations that might be useful. So maybe let's switch gears a little bit and talk about kind of the how do we fix it part of it. A few years ago, there was this big campaign to plant 1 billion trees. And every now and then, whether it's through the Green India Mission or India's commitment under NDCs and so on, and so how does one answer that question? Because there is also a sense on the other side of every time you see a barren piece of land, well, more trees is always better.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about what the implication of all this set of work that you've done for those.
Yeah. So that's where I think when the Ministry of Earth Sciences and the Natural Environment Research Council, UK, we had this collaborative program for supporting hydrologic research in India called the Changing Water Cycles. We were able to get one of those 5 grants.
Right.
And we established the instrumented catchments in Upper Nilgiris in Tamil Nadu and in the Agnashni Basin in Uttar Kannada in Karnataka. The Nilgiris work, where in collaboration with Federal, we were able to look at catchments which were grassland and across a gradient of being invaded by wattle.
Right. Wattle being an invasive species.
So there we were able to actually look at the impacts that invasive species, exotic species has had on the hydrology. And it's had some very interesting and concerning impacts. And I must say that Tamil Nadu is to be congratulated because it's one of the first states in India to actually now have a policy and a management for invasive species, recognizing that removal of invasive species such as wattle in some parts of the state and re-establishing grasslands if that is possible, because it is complicated to replace something that's...
There's a reason why species invade.
Yes. And so it's actually happening. So there is some, there was a High Court committee, we were part of it. And I must say that they were very open to the science that we felt very happy that our research has contributed to something on the policy side.
Right.
And earlier also, the works by Samraj and other folks, Sikka, in the Nilgiris had shown that blue gum eucalyptus was impacting the amount of water entering the reservoirs, hydropower reservoirs in the summer.
Right.
So there was concern that these exotic trees are not that great for for the hydrologic benefits, including energy production.
Right.
So I would say that this background really has helped the state government craft a policy and a response, and we'll have to see, because restoring back these ecosystems are not easy,
Right.
because wattle is an acacia and it's also a nitrogen fixing tree. So the proliferation of wattle all over the upper Nilgiris has resulted in increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil.
It's made these species actually make the environment more conducive for themselves, right? That's why they're invasive.
And biogeochemically, it's now a transformed system. The nitrogen is being exported through the streams that we have shown through our data. And so restoring back something that was 100 years ago, 50, 70, 80 years ago, may not be that easy. And so we have to, so restoration to some original pristine state or former state is very complicated.
Correct.
Because of this variety of reasons.
Yeah. That watershed is no longer the
And
same.
I also think that some of these trees are on steep hillsides, and uprooting them can lead to. And given that now we are facing such high levels of intense rain, during our study, in one day we got 920 mm recorded in 5 rain gauges in the Upper Nilgiris. It washed away an entire shola forest. So even natural ecosystems and semi-natural ecosystems are now are being impacted by these big events. So their ability to protect, themselves and others is also, there are some limits to that. And wattle on these steep hillsides, I think some of those places we have to be careful about uprooting trees. Even though we would like those, for an ecologist, getting back those grasslands would be great. But from the hydrology side, from the soil erosion point of view, we have also would not like to recommend large scale removal of trees, because now it's a different system.
Right.
It's not that the uprooting is going to
get back the past. So there's then two pieces of it, right? Forests which are quote unquote degraded just because they've thinned in over time. A lot of that was because of grazing and fuel wood collection and so on over decades and decades of overgrazing. And then there are these places where you have invasive species, wattle in the Nilgiris, but also lantana and prosopis in the semi-arid areas. Yeah. So then what should be, if you can never get back to the past, what should be goals of restoration then? How do you even arrive at that? Because it's a chicken and egg then.
Yes. So the goals of restoration, I think, should be based on realistic understanding of how people and other biodiversity and livestock, other stakeholders are engaging with the current conditions, and are they locked in economically or in other ways to this transformed system, and therefore complete removal or reversal to something that may not be possible. We have to, I think, take these factors into account, and I think do it at a scale that enables both nature and people to adapt to the changes over a period of time.
Right.
And seek new opportunities. So maybe the restoration itself can be a source of livelihood.
Right.
But these are not things that you and I can sit and, right? This involves so many people on the ground. Yes. And so it's a slightly longer term process. And it's complicated. But I think that restoration to some so-called original pristine state is difficult and maybe undesirable in some places because of new stakeholders coming in, new types of lock-in into livelihoods, and so we have to take all of this into account. And yes, there is a space for bringing back some of the original ecosystems, but even in places like Bani, as you know, whether it's the amount of salinity in the system, and
this is the Bani grasslands in Gujarat, of course,
and again semi-arid and dry, and so
which has been taken over by prosopis, and the community has basically gotten dependent on the prosopis.
Some folks in the community, local community, who earlier used to graze cattle and other livestock, have also now using prosopis to make charcoal and so on.
So what was a dairy economy based on grasslands becomes a charcoal economy, which is based on prosopis.
Yes.
Because now everybody has adapted. Should you force them to adapt back? Is there a... I mean, as academics, we like to think of this place where everybody comes into the room, everybody agrees, we bring the best science, and then we arrive at conservation goals. And then you have sort of restoration companies which do it in a very science based manner. In reality, of course, none of that happens.
No.
So then, is it too complicated? Should we just say let the chips fall where they may? Or can you give us two or three principles by which we can say all of this crazy amount of eco-hydrology can be kind of arrived at and or reduced to some set of principles?
Unless we experiment and fail and then learn from them, we are never going to progress. And so it will be messy, it will be difficult. And so we just have to be patient and we have to be tolerant of the way in which things move or happen. It's not going to be to everybody's liking. And yes, the science is there, but the science alone, I mean, finally, it's about the political economy. It's about the house people and government and everybody responds to this.
Right. But the science also is not perfect in the sense, while you may be able to say a wattle invaded ecosystem has this impact on flows in dry season and total flow, and so on, we can't actually say how whether the wattle will come back fiercely or you will be able to, using this set of techniques, successfully move to a grassland or restore to a grassland. Even that piece of it is still uncertain.
Yes.
Right? We may say once that happens, we can say something that happens to the water.
Yes.
But we can't say whether wattle will come back fiercely or a new regime can it'll flip to a new equilibrium essentially.
I think the scale at which species such as Prosopis and Lantana and others have spread and are established, I think that we'll have to manage and regulate them where we can, adapt to them in some places if possible, and also try our best to have whatever ecosystem that we want to have from the biodiversity point of view. It will still not be the same that was there earlier.
Sure. So if you had a 2 by 2 matrix of how critical it is to restore, in the sense of this was really important for an elephant corridor or this was really important for some key endangered species. So criticality of the forest being restored, and then the ease of restoration. What you're really saying is you only really want to go for the low-hanging fruit first, right? You go for places where you can restore, but also which are the most important to restore to start with.
Yes.
And then you start making your way across the other quadrants.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah. So, for example, the Nilgiri Tower, which is endemic to the mountains of the southern Western Ghats in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, those sites, that species requires these grasslands. So, in those sites where the species is found in a few places, definitely we should be thinking about active, making sure that there's no more invasion of prime habitat, and whichever habitats have been invaded to some extent we can try to restore. So that would be a goal which is set around one endangered species. But in other places like in the bunny with Prosopis, it's much more complex, and now with the cheetahs coming in, and that's also going to now people want to have grasslands for the cheetahs as well. So it adds to the complexity, and some of the decisions are going to be taken at much higher levels.
Right.
And then we have, as a community of scientists and practitioners, we have to respond to what may be.
I guess at the very least, we can say we can't influence political priorities, but we can say at least what would happen if you did this. And we can at least comment on likelihood of success.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay, so what I want to do, Jagdish, now is I want to switch from eco-hydrology to hydroecology. Again, you're one of the few people who's done just crazy amounts of work just on first looking at riverine species and then looking at the impacts of human alterations of river flows on those species and what the implications are. Maybe we should just take a step back on unpacking this idea of ecological flows, because most people who come from the water side, they're like, okay, leave a little bit of water for the species. And of course, your work says it's not that simple. So let's start with what are ecological flows and why do they matter? Why do we care about these random fish? And then we'll come to what human interventions, how they're actually changing some of these.
Yeah. So basically, the idea of ecological flows comes in because humans are appropriating a lot of water, which would have otherwise have been part of natural and semi-natural riverine ecosystems, wetlands, all the way from the headwaters to the deltas and estuaries, where flowing water and habitats created by sediment and water flows support a range of species, all the way from fish to crocodilians, river dolphins, India's national aquatic animal. So again, this is a topic that I got into thanks to the brilliant students and collaborators I got over a period of time, and they remain to this day, with Vidyadhar, Nachiket, Tarun, Shivana, and others. They were all biologists or ecologists, and often very passionate about the species whose conservation they were concerned about. And I brought in the hydrology perspective. And so I think that we learned a lot from each other. And now I think that they are very capable hydroecologists
In their own right.
Yes. So that I think is a very, I would say, been very rewarding. And we over a period of time we learned about the role that sediment plays in the river. What happens to species when a dam shuts off most of the water and sediment, uh, which is trapped in the reservoir, and most of the water is diverted through canals for agriculture. Then we started learning about. We all know that more than 80% of the accessible blue water is used, both groundwater and surface water is used for agriculture. So the connections with agriculture became something important for us. Even though we were studying the species and the river ecology, these connections from the point of view of changing anything, I think became apparent.
Right.
And of course, the experience that we had in the Gandak, the Son, the Ganga, Kosi, and also in the Western Ghats rivers, we learned a lot about how our rivers and streams have been transformed,
right,
by in one way or the other, either by barrage or dam or even small dams, and so-called green hydropower, green energy as well. And we found that the impacts on endemic species, fish species in the Western Ghats or the Gharial and the river dolphin, or even on fisheries, the wild capture fisheries, is of river flows is huge.
Yeah.
And we also know that these dams and reservoirs came for a particular reason, and some of them are required. When India's part of the Green Revolution was watered by the all the dams and reservoirs that were built, but also for hydropower and elsewhere. So we have a highly regulated hydrology in most parts of the country already.
Right.
Most of our rivers have dams on the main river or on tributaries. In some cases,
both,
several of them. So, in a highly regulated hydrologic system, the space, an opportunity for these species to persist and breed exists in some places. And so we try to find out, okay, what is it about that particular stretch of river? Why is it that we're still having some flow downstream, even though the water? Then we found out, okay, that there is the water is going to the farmers. Farmers are actually not using the canal water; they're using groundwater, and so there is seepage from the canal. Some of it ends back in the river. So you have these complexities leading to this
unintended ecological flows. Is what you're
and saying. But it's not part of policy or management,
right.
And so it's vulnerable,
right.
And
it could go away if the farmers
yes.
just all switch their cropping.
We also, I think, as a group of folks that realize that, so-called pristine rivers, which are undammed from headwaters to estuaries, it's almost impossible. We have very few of
There's
them.
A handful in the Western Ghats because they are very short in length. And
Aghnashni is one of the few west-flowing rivers without a dam on it.
Let's talk about the Gharial for a moment, because just maybe walk us through the Son Gharial, the work that you did in the Son Gharial Sanctuary.
Yeah. So there, thanks to the National Green Tribunal and then other folks like Ravi Chalam and Madhya Pradesh Forest Department, we got this opportunity to work in the Son Gharial Sanctuary, which is about 210 kilometers of the Son River, downstream of the Bansagar Dam, which is one of the very big dams inaugurated by the Prime Minister of India. And then soon after the reservoir filled, then the impacts on the started on the downstream, and the gharial habitat deteriorated. And so
gharials are, of course, these small crocodile-like.
No, they can be fairly big, but they're a fish-eating crocodile, endemic to our Indo-Gangetic river systems. Brahmaputra's river system. So this species is range restricted and endangered. There are only few places in India where it breeds in the wild. The Son Gharial sanctuary had one site which was where the gharial was still breeding. And that's where we were told that the minimum flow in that river in the dry season is 50 cubic meter per second. So when we actually went and measured it in the dry season, it was between 12 to 15 meter cube per second, far below what people are telling us. And this is from established agencies.
So the official data said 50
yes,
and you found 12.
Yeah. And that's where we were looking at two issues. One is, of course, that you have too less water in the river, and for some species, even going upstream and downstream will be difficult. But there was another complication. So Bihar share of the water from the Bansagar Dam. So every reservoir and the dam, there's a sharing agreement between different states. In this case, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Bihar. So Bihar share of water from the Bansagar reservoirs was released through the river. In some sense, that was a lifeline for the ecology of the river. If it had been through any other system, then we would have.
So luckily, because Bihar share was going through the sanctuary, there was an ecological flow maintained in the sanctuary.
Yeah, unintended in some way, whatever.
Okay.
But the sudden releases during the dry season used to wipe out the nesting and the basking sites of the gharial and the Indian skimmer, which is a ground nesting bird, another endangered species. So we were, for the first time in 1 year when we were in the field, we were able to inform the dam authorities not to release water in a particular manner, and they actually did that. And so we were able to save some of the nesting that year, and without any loss of benefits to Bihar.
Right. It's just don't do it all at once, do it slowly.
So I think that's when we realized that the opportunity to manage our dams and reservoirs to minimize ecological damage downstream and for the conservation of endangered species, and possibly even for fisheries and other human uses for in other places. That is, I think, something that we need to explore and actually come up with for a variety of reasons. One, our rainfall patterns are changing, which means that holding back a lot of water in reservoirs till the last minute and then releasing it all at once. We know that many dams have been implicated in floods and devastation downstream. There was controversy even amongst the engineering lobby after the 2018 Kerala floods on rule curves and how our reservoirs should be managed. Given in this era of climate change, I think with changes in rainfall intensity, we need to rethink how we manage our reservoirs for a variety of reasons, of which one is, of course, because of changes in our rainfall intensities, but also the impact on ecology downstream.
Right.
I think this is the right time for engineers, ecologists, and all to actually work together to, at least for the future, any other water management systems that we put in place, we should be taking this into account. And our river sharing agreements, whether it's between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, or between disputes or agreements, whichever, depending on whether the agreement is there in place or not, we need to think about the downstream ecology.
Right.
And the river as a shared, it's not about, looking at a river as simply as a place where water can be abstracted. So in some previous cases, the tribunal used to say inevitable wastage into the sea and all that. So we need to change that, and ecological flows should become an integral part of river sharing.
But ecological flow is not just being like 5%, but basically also trying to understand some of the things of the flow regimes even within a day. You're not looking at total quantum.
Yes.
But the hydrograph really matters.
It matters. The shape, in some sense, of the hydrograph is what needs to be mimicked when we release water or manage water in the river, even though we are not going to get back the same amount of water in the dry season as we used to. But we certainly can avoid this type of damages through sudden releases of water. And
so at least you don't do the truly stupid stuff.
That's one.
That's the basic.
The other thing is, of course, as you know very well, as being part of Well Labs, is our use of water in agriculture. And our work in the Gandak suggests that even a small shift in cropping patterns from sugarcane to something else No, we're not talking about a huge amount of 5 to 10% of the area. If you change to some other crop, provide some economic incentives. However that's managed, that's beyond my capability to. But the system needs to figure out a way how to achieve that. You will have an ecologically meaningful amount of water in the dry season in the Gandak. And it's still a real jewel in terms of aquatic biodiversity. And because, as I said, because of all those seepages and leakages and other things, and now we can't be dependent on things like that, right? Want it to be part of policy.
Yeah.
And I think that this ecological flows should not be about just the minimum amount of water. It's actually an ecological flow regime, and all the way from headwaters to estuaries and deltas. I think the water, sediments, and nutrients reaching our estuaries and deltas, it sustains a lot of fisheries.
Right.
So that connection has not been made.
Many livelihoods based on those fisheries, right?
Yeah.
If you find this episode to be valuable, please like the video and check out more episodes of the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel. And if you think someone else, maybe a colleague, a student, a friend, or a fellow water enthusiast, might find this show useful, do share it with them. We hope to reach many more change makers like you. Since this is the Water Data podcast, can you tell a little bit about the challenges with water data? Because I know some of the stories from the past. So do you want to tell us how difficult it is? Because I think it's important for people, we know that a lot of our young hydrologists in this country haven't actually seen a gauging station.
Yes.
Many of them just see the data, and then the data is used to calibrate a model. But once you actually go, and I don't know how many days you have to walk or how many hours you have to hike to get into Gharial Sanctuary, and then you see that gauging station, and then you realize that everything is not the way we think it is.
So without naming places and institutions, we have seen good and bad gauging stations. So one heartwarming for a hydrologist, it's a heartwarming sight to see somebody wheel out a current meter and go on across the bridge and then measure the velocity
and get the rating curve.
That was in a river in the Western Ghats. So I knew that the
data was reliable.
The gauging station folks were actually doing some work. Primary. This is the type of data that contributes to estimating because stage is measured continuously. You can automate it, but you need these velocity measurements to convert the
stage to volume
and the cross-sectional area into a volume of water per unit time, which is what all hydrologists need, and that to be maintained not just daily. In some cases, we need it every half hour or hourly.
We don't do the rating curve hourly, but the stage data.
Yeah, the stage data is being recorded at high resolution, temporal resolution, but without the velocity measurements from time to time. Now there are sophisticated methods. You don't have to use a current meter and the manual and the board-based work that we used to do. We have been doing. In some cases, it still works very well. The old-fashioned but good methods. But in other places, there are alternatives. But nevertheless, I think the quality of secondary data is dependent on these high doses of primary data coming in at regular intervals.
Right.
And I think the integrity of our secondary hydrology data was questionable in some places.
Right.
And it basically meant you can't use that for making inferences about effects of land use and land cover change, or for that matter, ecological flows.
Because the rivers had changed, but no rating curves had ever been updated.
In some situations, yes. And I think that things have improved. But as we saw from our other examples in the past, we've seen one gauging station where we know that nobody did work on some days, and they managed to get some certain types of measurements out. It's there in the records. So what does that mean? It means it's sort of made up.
Yeah.
So I think that it can happen in other parts of the world as well. But I think that given how important water is, I think that we really need reliable, high-quality data in order to make. It's difficult enough to make decisions based on good data, but impossible
to make it with no data.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your work in the small hydropower projects in the Western Ghats, because that's interesting. Again, can you paint a picture of the effort that it takes to do this kind of work? Because I know what Vidyadhar did in some of those cases. So can you just walk us through that?
Vidyadhar and Shishir. Vidyadhar worked on slightly moderately sized rivers. Shishir worked on, and Suman. They were again ecologists, interested in fish and so on, and then they learned hydrology. That was one contribution that.
And they were looking at the impact of hydropower.
Hydropower, and these hydropower.
The small hydropower, the so-called green
Yes,
one.
they didn't require much of environmental scrutiny, and they were being promoted as part of green energy. But we found that because where they're located in the headwaters streams, they have a disproportionate impact on endemic fish species, because those fish species are found in those places. Plus, because you have to go to these interior places, there is inevitable clearing of forest for the roads and for the infrastructure to be established. So that removes some of the green from the project itself in that sense. And then in terms of impacts, because these are small streams, so in the hydropower cycle, they have to, in the dry season especially, they have to wait for the reservoir to reach a particular level. So they hold back the water, and then release that water through a canal, which is not in the. It's by the side of the river.
It's a pipe going along the river, a big pipe going along the river.
And it generates power, and then that water, after the power is generated, that water will be released back into the stream.
Yeah.
Sometimes a few kilometers downstream.
Right.
So you have this dewatered stretch where
it's 2 kilometers of not a drop of water in the stream.
But it's basically an ecological trap for any fish or other species, which, during the time when there is water, they end up in those places, and then suddenly, they find that there is not enough water.
Right.
So these ecological traps are there. So in this dewatered stretch, plus the hydropower cycle itself was leading to, in the downstream section, it was leading to sometimes a cycle where the water level went from a few centimeters to 50 or 60 centimeters within a few minutes or 20 minutes. And every 20 minutes, there would be something like that.
And no fish can survive that kind of a flow.
Many organisms, including fish, will not be able to adapt to this type of artificial subdiurnal, sub-daily cycles.
Yeah.
But during the day also, and of course even in the night, and so this was something that I think for the first time we were able to generate data on.
So the actual data basically involves having these students stand in the middle of a stream with these nets and catch fish, and then
identify them, look at the size distribution, and then of course they would have had to instrument the stream as well in order for us to get hold of
flow
that
regime.
Because every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, we need that data for us to figure out what the hydrograph is looking like because of the dam operating.
Right.
So I think these were, we now have a group of people who have generated scholarship on this, and the data is there, evidence is there. And I think that we do know that small hydro projects, many of them in the same basin, can actually have a very
because you have
big impact.
Tens of kilometers of dewatered stretches, and then this.
And then we are calling it as green energy.
Right.
So I think that we need to be careful about where we site them and not have too many of them. And in some places where they're, if the benefits are, because the loss is irreparable in some cases. So you might want to say, is this worth it?
Yeah. I mean, I call this the engineers don't get biology problem.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, most of the time when you speak to engineers, if the only things you measure is sort of energy and quantum of water, and that was the quantum of water integrated over a month, like total, TMC.
Yes.
Then the fact that you've basically killed every species in that place, you've put zero value on that. So your cost is zero, but your benefit is huge.
Yes.
And engineers, of course, myself being one as well, will quantify it if there were numbers. But because you have no numbers, and the work that people like you and all of the many, many people you've mentored is really, really crucial in shedding light on just what we are losing, if not a monetary value, but at least in terms of species and decrease in species richness and so on. And it's tremendous.
Yeah. I think there's a lot more work required to be done in different, because we have such diverse rivers
Right.
in terms of their geology, in terms of their rainfall characteristics, even seasonality. And we know that because of extraction of groundwater for agriculture, many streams and rivers which are fed by groundwater in the dry season, that hydrology also has been changed in many parts.
Right.
So it's a short term. There are things that we can do in the short term, and there are some things that we'll have to achieve over a few decades.
Right.
Changes in agriculture to reduce the amount of water being used. And it's not about efficiency at the farm level.
Right.
You and I know that you can have drip irrigation in one farm, and if the so-called saved water is then used to grow banana in the next field where nothing was being grown earlier,
yeah,
you effectively at the basin scale you haven't achieved anything from the.
Well, you've got more crop per drop,
Yes,
which is great.
Yeah,
but it's not going to help any fish.
It's so converting, and I've yet to see. I mean, we have a very welcome push towards millets and pulses and so on. I've yet to see an example where a water intensive crop has been changed to a less water intensive crop, and the saved water is leading to an ecological bonus.
Right.
It's a dream right now.
No.
I don't think that even otherwise it has happened.
No.
We are rightfully investing in rain-fed agriculture and making it giving incentives to farmers to grow millets, and there is a uptake of millets in many places. Karnataka has a very nice millet festival. Many people are switching back to millets because of nutritional and health issues.
Right.
That part is great.
Yeah.
But
it's not going to go back to the environment.
But the saved water is not going back either into the ground or into the nearest wetland or river.
No, it's going on to more land.
So we need to now figure out how saved water can go back to nature. And as we know, with cities basically take good water from other places and from the ground, surface and groundwater, and then convert it into bad water, right?
But if you treat that could go back.
Treating a good fraction of it, and Bengaluru, I think, has done quite well in treating wastewater. Not enough, but it's a start, I think. And there's experiments in using it for agriculture elsewhere, with whatever health concerns still there because of our treatment may not be adequate and being managed well all the time. But nevertheless, I think cities are going to generate a lot of wastewater.
But that's still going to agriculture. It's no city saying my wastewater I will fully treat because I want to restore a river.
It has not yet happened, but you would find that some folks are saying that the treated wastewater has rejuvenated water bodies and more birds are coming in and all that. So that is, in some places, that's probably happening.
Yeah.
So, but for example, the Yamuna River in Delhi, if we have to restore that, the pollution load is very high.
I mean, that's going to come from Delhi getting its act together.
And the upstream hydrology has to, the amount of water entering the Yamuna in Delhi in the dry season is also an issue, right?
Right.
So I think that requires interventions and interstate cooperation. It seems very difficult sometimes when you look at these issues.
Right.
But I think that's we have to work towards looking at rivers as living ecosystems from headwaters all the way to estuaries and deltas, and not just simply look at them as pipelines and conduits for water abstraction. And so the discourse earlier on watershed management and water management, in water resources management, didn't have the ecological concerns at all.
No.
This is very recent.
Right.
And we need to really invest in good experiments with some risks, with existing reservoirs and dams and barrages, even whether it's Faraka Barrage or whether it's other dams and reservoirs. We should have meaningful experiments to figure out, okay, if we release more water, and what are the trade-offs? Can we manage those trade-offs economically and politically, and yet ensure that there is water for the fish and the gharial, and also enough sediment moving through the river system? That's another part of ecological flows. People think it's all about water, but it's also about sediment.
Yeah.
Because the sediment is the basis for all the different habitats where species like the gharial need to bask and nest. Even freshwater turtles or river otters use them. And it's also important for the sediment at the bottom of a river. The substrate also plays a role in terms of fish as well.
I mean, we need many more people like you who are just going to go and measure stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because we can do all of the experiments, but somebody needs to be there to say, I will count the fish, I will count the nesting sites, I will count the breeding sites. And that is really where this intersection of hydrology and ecology, whether it's eco-hydrology or hydroecology, plays. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about sediment for a second, because you did a lot of work on sediments, particularly in Kudremukh and so on.
Yeah.
Can you talk us a little bit through how the sediment part of reservoirs and rivers have changed because of human intervention?
Yeah. So reservoirs are places where sediment accumulates. And which means that the downstream section is going to be starved of sediment.
Right.
And there is this paradigm which was found out in the many decades ago. There's even an equation called Lane's equilibrium, which talks about something called hungry water. So when you have a river water flowing from upstream to downstream, it's converting potential energy into kinetic energy.
Right.
And so it has a lot of energy to do lots of stuff. To balance this, not as a thing that's designed, but it happens that there's also resistance to this. So there's work done by the flowing water. So it loses some of its energy because it has to, uh, carry the water and the sediments.
Right.
The resistance is offered by the banks with sand, mud, gravel, and the bottom of the river,
Right.
and also the viscosity of the air above the river.
Right.
All of that, and the sediment that's being carried by this water, that cuts into some of that kinetic energy and dissipates it.
Right.
So if you remove too much of sediment from a flowing river, it has this excess.
It starts eroding downstream.
Yes, it could. So that's the hungry waters paradigm, right. And it can cause a lot of devastation. So that's one aspect. The second thing is, of course, the sediment that is mobilized by river ecosystems during big floods from time to time. That gets deposited and forms these habitats, whether it's these islands in the river, it's river banks, sandbars, all very important for many species of birds, reptiles, mammals. And so I think that is one thing that we have to think about, which is something that sometimes people will narrow view of looking at sediments only as a problem.
Right.
And sediments can be a problem in localized situations.
Right.
Now, we know that not all rivers in India are coming from young mountains where a lot of sediment is being generated. Like the Himalayan rivers, young mountain systems still is tectonically active. The rivers are cutting through, they generate a lot of sediment. So removal of sediment, some sand mining, I know it's ugly, it's bad in many localized it looks, but at least enough sediment is being generated to sustain.
Right.
But when you look at very highly weathered systems, which much older mountains, including some parts of the Western Ghats or in the...
and these are granitic systems, they're not so erodible in the first place.
So if you extract too much of sediment, first of all, you've trapped sediment in the reservoir, so that itself has deprived the downstream section of this sediment. And two, you then have sand mining and other things remove whatever sediment is there downstream, beyond a point. And I think that is an irreparable loss to the riverine ecosystem.
I mean, if you look at I've seen some satellite imagery of the Kaveri, where it looks like there's a long snake along the side of the river. And then when you zoom in, you can see like 10-kilometer long line of sand mining trucks. So, I mean, that's an example.
The thing is that a lot of sand is in demand.
Yeah.
And we have to now figure out some ways of managing and regulating this.
Yeah.
And which also means, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a expert in this part of, but we definitely need to do something about alternatives. And two, use sand frugally.
Yeah.
It has to be something. It shouldn't be very cheap, because it's at the cost of a river ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so it should not...
If you're using natural versus some synthetic stuff which is made from recycled.
Or constructed sand or whatever those...
And this, on the other hand, CND waste ends up in landfills. So we do a terrible job on all of our... But we're deviating a little bit from where we started, because... Can I just ask you one more question about dams? Because, you've talked a whole bunch about how dams are completely changing. Sediment flows downstream, water flows downstream, therefore ecology and livelihoods and so on. India spends hundreds of thousands of crores building these dams. And of course, there's a big lobby which says, you can't really survive on groundwater. Dams are kind of the only thing we can do. My question is, why haven't we figured out how to just build better dams? Because people say, oh, we can. Oh, you're worried about fish. Let's put some few fish ladders there.
Fish ladders haven't worked in India.
Correct. And why? Why is it that we can't design dams to manage sediment and ecological flows better? Why is it that after 75 years of independence, we still are asking the same questions of, our dams are destroying ecology, so on and so forth. Why can't we just do better? What's the evidence, what's the data that's needed for us to do better?
Yes, we do have sufficient data for at least to take some action, and we need to definitely invest more. But there are some things we can do with dams as well, for new dams. So, for example, to the best of my knowledge, there are very few dams in India with lower level sluices. And that is one way in which
That's to flush out the sediment.
For sediment can be during certain high flows in the beginning of the monsoon, we can flush out some sediment out of this. So this would be something. This is a question I've posed to some engineers, and I've not received an answer about whether how many dams in India have lower level sluices. To the best of my knowledge, I think there are very few.
Is it an engineering concern that they are worried that the sluice can't take the?
So I'm just wondering whether in the design of some of these dams, the sediment, the 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 need for sediment to be transferred from the reservoir downstream. Also, accumulation of sediment in the reservoir is also not a great thing, right? You're changing the capacity of the reservoir to hold water.
Right.
So I think that there needs to be some thought, and I think the dam engineers need to be brought into this. The designers, they need to be brought in, and we need to now figure out, is this feasible? In which dams if new dams, can we do this? Is there anything we can do with the existing systems in terms of
what
barrages?
do other countries do, though? Because other countries do, at least they do better. I mean,
there are some dams where sediment transfer from upstream to downstream is happening.
In other countries?
Yes.
And then what about the ecology side of it?
Ecology side also, I mean, there have been some removal of dams in some parts of the world.
Of course, not all the way there, but just better management.
Yes, and in some cases, because of the economic and other cultural reasons for maintaining, say, salmon fishery, you want to remove dams, but I don't think we are talking about that here. I think we should be focusing on better management, informed management of existing water infrastructure, and a rethink on small dams or big dams in new places. Because increasingly those are going to be places where, either tectonically active, very high sediment loads, ecologically and geologically fragile. So we really need to think. I know that we can't, at least that you make sure that you really, there's no other way you can do that. And so instead of, if this was a concern, surely there would be a few projects which would not be taken up. In fact, India has had a history of giving up a few projects for biodiversity and ecology. So the Silent Valley Dam, which was pushed heavily by the then political system, was dropped, right? And now it's a national park.
I mean, there's almost I think one of the reasons for having this conversation also is historically, it's always been that activists are anti-development, right? And we've reached a point of India's economic growth where we have enough of an urban population and economy that realizes that a future where we've destroyed all of our natural heritage was maybe development for which we paid a price too much. And it's not that we are anti-development, it's just that we want to not have irreversible destruction and find other ways of doing it.
Yeah, and also about the people who have been displaced and impacted. So for many decades, there was no rehabilitation policy.
Correct.
Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was the person who helped found the Central Water Commission.
Right.
In fact, even even before independence, 1946, I think at that time it was called the Navigation, Irrigation, and Water Center Commission, and then it was renamed as the Central Water Commission. And he was such a strong advocate for looking at people who are impacted by because of their caste and other by projects, and I think if he had lived long enough to see the impact that some of the dams have had on entire communities,
And cultures.
yes, he would have, I think, been the first to protest. And I think that we need to look at the costs that we have paid socially, and in some cases ecologically, and also now we are realizing that rivers flowing into the sea is not a waste. They are meant to reach the sea, and they actually provide lots of services to us through fisheries, and many other benefits.
Right.
We celebrate our rivers in our national anthem. We call many of our rivers sacred. But why is it that
we look at them purely utilitarian manner?
It doesn't somehow, the flowing river is not what you want to protect or preserve, right? So I think some of that also we need to, I think,
bring back some of the cultural feeling, heritage, reverence that we had. But then bring the data and science into saying, we're not saying, stop looking at the rivers for their water, but we're saying...
So we are going to have to manage water. We're not going to have pristine rivers, very few of them. In some places, I think we should allow some rivers to at least flow so that at least we have some ecological legacy of those types of rivers as well. But for other rivers which are regulated, we have to find better ways of managing water for humans and nature, and ultimately looking at the benefit that nature provides to us as a way of managing our water resources.
Yeah, looking at the benefits nature provides alongside on the same scale as the economic benefits.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Jagdish, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. We've covered a huge amount, and I hope that you've already created kind of a cadre of people on eco-hydrology and hydroecology in this country, and I'm sure many generations to come will continue with that work. But I hope at least a few people listening to this podcast are kind of inspired with the kind of work we've done, just detailed primary work, and then just field work of measuring stuff, stepping in rivers, counting fish, that sort of thing. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real privilege and pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Veena. It's been a great evening.
That's it for this episode of the Water Data Podcast. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find the Water Data Podcast on all major podcast platforms. Until then, stay curious and stay connected. Thank you.